So we'll get it kicked off. There still may be some more come in, but why don't you start by just giving us a couple minutes of where'd you grow up? What led you to your career in the Army? When did you know that you were going to spend your career in the Army?
Well, thank you very much, Randy, and appreciate everyone taking their time this morning to engage in this discussion. Just by way of introduction, I grew up in central New York State, the Finger Lakes area primarily, the wine country there. My father worked for one of the public utilities, so we moved around every couple of years, but generally in that part of New York State. My mother's an immigrant. My father's parents and his three oldest brothers are immigrants, and we really lived the American dream. My father was able to work hard in high school and get a scholarship to college, and had a great job, stable job. So I knew that I wanted to somehow give back to my country. So I thought, a great way of doing that would be to serve in the Army, in the armed forces, the Army specifically, because I had some family that had served in the Army previously. My plan was to serve for a few years and then move on to something else. But what I found after a year or two was that I worked with a lot of great people on a very important mission and was able to make a difference every day. So I decided over time to make it a career. So I never really planned on staying in the Army over 31 years. Just kind of happened that way. Every time it seemed like a logical time to get out of the Army and do something else, then another great opportunity came in front of me. So that's really where I come from. I'm gonna talk today just for a couple minutes before we kick off, and I really had a sort of an unusual experience in the Army. I spent a lot of my time in the Army really sort of at the corporate level of the Army, headquarters, department of the Army, large 3- and 4-star major headquarters. And so, one of the reasons I'm going to go and focus on that is, I spent about my first 12 or 13 years in the Army doing, the typical tactical Army leadership positions. And I served in Desert Storm, but there are far more qualified people to talk about some of the challenges of combat leadership than myself. In fact, I think I saw Drew Myrich on here. I can't think of a better person to talk to if you'd like to know some of the ins and outs of combat leadership, particularly at the small unit level. Drew is a tremendous reputation in the Army as a tremendous combat leader. My experience at sort of headquarters department of the Army happened sort of by chance, but it was a great opportunity to be able to work there. And one morning I went out for a run. I'd been there about a year. I went out for a run. It was a beautiful day, really the first day of the summer, late summer. That didn't have that oppressive DC humidity. And I was getting back to the office a little bit late. It was about 8:30 or so in the morning. I go back to my desk and start working, and had to go and meet a couple other folks for a few minutes, came back, and I'm working at my computer, and I hear one of my office mates behind me speaking on the phone in Spanish. So I figure Crispin's probably talking to his wife. And so he gets off the phone and he says, "Hey guys, we just happen to all be males in that part of the office. Hey guys, my wife just told me that a second plane hit the second World Trade Center tower." We all kind of looked at each other and realized that, hey, this obviously was not an accident. This was some sort of act of terrorism, and our lives were certainly going to change significantly. Um, and I knew all of the planning that we had done, we were going to have to rapidly adjust. Um, the office that I worked in, what we did was we developed the 6-year budget for the Army, extended budget, extended planning period for the Army. And it was much more detailed than just, hey, we need about this much money for this much money for that. It actually went down to program level execution, how much you were going to execute in each year on each separate program. So it took us about a year to develop, and we had literally just a week and a half before it turned that into the Office of the Secretary of Defense for their review. And we realized, hey, this is all going to change now. So, this was really a great example of a time in which something completely out of the blue came upon us. It wasn't something that many people at all had even really thought about or had given much credence to or were prepared for at all. But we were able to successfully make the shift and be able to finance the Army for what it needed to do in the coming years. And it really comes down to, I believe, 3 things. One is leadership. I know we hear this all the time, but leadership is absolutely the most critical element to handle. My dog's going nuts up here. It must be a fire siren or an ambulance or something. But it's the leadership that drives the second element, and that's the culture. And only if you have the right culture are you going to achieve those results. So I look at things through the lens of leadership, driving the culture, and the culture driving the results. So in this instance, immediately everyone responded exactly the way they should have, and it was the cool, directed leadership that really set the tone for what we were going to be able to do. And it was not just what the leadership did in that moment, but what that leadership had done for years and years and years by developing a culture of candor, of healthy friction, of teamwork within the organization, so that we could identify what these challenges were and really address them. What most people know about the military and the Army in particular is no fault of their own. It's what they've seen on TV or a movie, and they see this fairly autocratic organization because what they've seen is down at the tactical level under some very severe conditions. But really, once you get up to the higher levels of the Army, it's really very collegial. Being a formal organization, we don't call each other Mary and Bob and Jim, but by and large, the senior leadership in the Army, they want to get the best decisions and the best information to drive those decisions, regardless of where it came from. So the ability to provide a variety of feasible courses of action or ways forward with an analytical underpinning, that's what's critical in the Army. So that said, the other part of the culture is that once the decision is made at that level, everyone's had the opportunity to participate. Everyone's views have been heard, but then, much like I believe you wish in your organization, is once the decision's made, then everyone moves out in the same direction. And again, that's really what gets your results. So again, had various opportunities at headquarters department in the Army and at large commands. One of my favorite jobs in the Army was when I was at this level, was when I was the director of Army business operations. You can imagine $135 billion a year operation, 1.1 million people. It is literally, the old analogy of trying to making change in our army wide is like trying to turn an aircraft carrier around. But again, even at that level, it really always came down to leadership, culture that drove the culture, and then the culture was what allowed us to achieve the results. So I just wanted to take a couple minutes to give you some background on myself and what I've done, and I'd really like to entertain any questions anyone has.
You wrote an article 2 or 3 weeks ago that caught my attention about never letting a good crisis go to waste, which normally we think of that quote in a political context. But you had an interesting take on it and the opportunity that particularly business leaders have right now to drive improvement in their operations and put in measures and metrics and programs to help build a better business coming out of this slowdown that we're in. You want to build on that thought a minute?
No, absolutely. It goes back to that construct of leadership, culture, and results. It's not as difficult to lead an organization when things are going fairly well. And in most parts of the economy, let's face it, over the last couple of years, things have been going pretty well. But the real challenge is when there is a crisis, when the going gets tough. And even people that you thought were capable leaders or even great leaders under normal circumstances, they don't cut it when the pressure's really on. Whether it be character flaw, lack of training, lack of leader of development, whatever it may be. And that's true. And again, Drew is really the guy to expound on this. But even when I was a young lieutenant in Desert Storm, some folks that were super leaders that you thought were superstars during peacetime training events and things like that, when it came to no kidding, fighting, rockets are coming in, artillery's coming in. All of a sudden, they're not up to the task, and that's been true in every crisis crisis-like situation that I've been through in the Army. So this is an opportunity for you to look at your leadership, top to bottom, and see, who was still able to perform, who was able to maintain the confidence of the people that they lead, who was able to think clearly about the situation and come up with solutions to the problems, and the next is culture. When things get tough, your culture gets strained as well.
Brendan asks, when you had conflicting priorities, how did you determine which to focus resources and energy on and which to say no to?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. Oftentimes we seemingly have, or we do have, priorities that conflict. And what you've really got to do is look at which is a higher priority, number one, and you've got to attack that and apply resources to that. But while you're doing that, you've got to look at, I may not be able to get after all of one of my other priorities, but there may be some pieces and parts that I can get after that will move the organization forward towards our goals. And then when additional resource, either the first priority is satisfied and that frees up resources, or additional resources are made available, then you can apply those to your second and third priorities.
Adam texted a message here. Thank you for your service and leadership. Do you see this crisis making lasting changes to our armed forces processes, and how might those translate to the civilian world?
Yeah, what we're on right, this Zoom call that we're on right now, interestingly enough, I'll bet you over the last 5 or 6 years that I was in the Army, about 80% of my meetings, I'd say at least, were done in this manner. Were done by video, some video teleconference capability. So this was not anything that's new. We realized, uh, certainly in the Army years ago, how much money and how much time can be saved by doing this. It's not recognizing it's not the same as being there, and there are oftentimes uh, reasons that you have to be there in person. You know, to initially meet someone and to build that connection with that person, there's no substitute for being there in person. But once you've done that and you've built that trust between people in your organization, then this is a very satisfactory way of doing it when you can't get together. So we save so much time, so much money by doing this. So this is one thing I think that is going to be enduring. This identification, this realization that one, we don't have to be together. Two, physically always. Two, we can still make those connections and we can still communicate. And three, people can oftentimes be just as productive or even more productive working remotely. So I think that's going to be enduring. And then there's some of the second and third order effects. Randy, you and I talked about this a little bit the other day. Boy, I tell you what, I would not want to be in the commercial real estate business right now, particularly if I had a lot of office space that I was trying to rent, because I think people that were very hesitant to allow their workers to work remotely, either full time or even part time. I think are realizing, there's some benefits to this, and I think a lot of employees, a lot of your teammates are going to really start to, I won't say demand, but really try to look at, hey, you know, I don't necessarily need to be in the office every day. You know, what can I do from home? How often can I do that? So I think it's going to really reduce the demand for office space. I just sent an email to a friend of mine the other day who literally on the 1st of March moved into a larger office space because their organization was growing. So I'd thought about him shortly, probably a month ago, but I figure I'd let it kind of cool down a little bit before I find out what he says. But I tell you, if I had that office space, the folks that are going to be successful are forward thinking. How is this going to change? Um, you know, I know got a friend that has a business here in town that does distribution, and the warehouse operation isn't going to be able to be done remotely, obviously, but a lot of the office space is. So a lot of the office jobs are being done remotely, and he's not sure he's going to need those folks to come back. So even within a building, hey, can I lease some of that space out that I don't think I need? Hey, can I, turn it into my own little Plex pod, or remote, those those shared work environments. If I've got a large office building, are there some other uses for it? So 3D printing, some light manufacturing. Can I uh, double down on the backbone, the utilities, the HVAC, and maybe host server farms or things like that? So again, someone who's got a large capital investment in those type of facilities, certainly I think would behoove them to think of some creative uses for them. So I think this is number one, is this greater acceptance of a dispersed and remote workforce is number one. I think number two is the realization that sometimes we take for granted our relationships with customers, suppliers, with peer organizations that we work closely with. Uh, because we just may happen to see some of their leaders, whether it be at a networking event or some other type of activity, a business. It might be at a convention or seminar or something like that. That we're not seeing them in that way anymore. So we realize that we've got to be very purposeful about not only developing but cultivating and sustaining our relationships with, again, with our, not just with our workforce, but with those outside that are, whether they be customers, suppliers, et cetera, is the importance of doing that.
Hey, General, wondered if you could give me your quick opinion, and I think we'd all be interested in hearing. There's talk in the past month about immunization from this virus and other viruses, and there's a lot of talk about herd immunization being the way that we have dealt with prior SARS viruses. The herd gets infected, we develop natural antibodies. Protecting the herd from getting infected there's been a lot of talk about that's the best thing that we've seen, protect us from these epidemics, and we're not doing that right now. I wondered what your opinion was on that, and also people believe that we can get a vaccine that a mutating virus we can outsmart a mutating virus with a vaccine. What's your opinion on that?
Carl, I really don't have any expertise in those areas, aside from the fact that I know that the Army does a lot of research and has developed many vaccines in the past, of which I have never had the option as to whether I was going to receive them or not. So that's never come into play. But related to your previous question, the previous question about how things change, by its very nature, the military, particularly the Army, has people working in very close proximity. So in general, people are very cognizant of ensuring that their behavior does not endanger other people. Because I'll tell you, there's 4 people in a tank crew. All right, there's no way right now. There's no way around that. They're going to be in close contact. They literally share the air in close proximity. So as a result of that, people are in general very careful about, as best they can, not touching things that other people touch, particularly if someone on that crew is sick. Proper hygiene. If you went, this is years and years and years. When you had the opportunity out in the field, when you were training or even in combat, if you had the opportunity to have hot food, the very first thing in that line was a hand wash station. And almost always there was someone in one of the senior leaders of the organization right there, making sure that everyone's complying, because again, we realized how quickly those things can happen without proper field sanitation. You can take a unit down in nothing flat with something as simple as bad water. So again, I'm not a technical expert on immunizations or anything like that, but I think that the military is going to have to continue to operate and be very careful about that. And I think that companies, whether it's manufacturing or sales or wherever the people work, I think they're going to be much more cognizant of it as well.
I got a question here, David, from Amy. What do you consider to be the most critical competency of a leader during a crisis?
I think there's 2, and I know that's a cop out, but number 1 is empathy. if you cannot have an appreciation for what someone else is going through, and in this instance, a lot of people are going through are fairly similar situations, but it becomes even more difficult when you've never experienced something that someone else is experiencing. So number one, empathy, and number two would have to be being able to keep keeping your emotions very level, being able to make calm, cool decisions. Because again, I went back to leadership drives everything. If the leader is calm, if the leader can make rational decisions in a timely manner and in a very measured way, that if the leader's calm, it's going to go a very long way to producing that calming effect on the rest of the organization. So again, being able to remain calm, whether you call that composure or what, is second to empathy.
Got another question here from Kent. When businesses come back online, they tend to freeze up and make poor personnel decisions or are paralyzed into failure.
Yeah, thank you, Randy. The situation that we face right now as a company, we're an investigative agency and we do a lot of things when it comes to executive protection and workplace violence intervention. But we have a lot of companies right now that are using the crisis to eliminate problem children in the organization, and they do it via Zoom because the hierarchy either has an issue on I don't want to bring these people back in, or I'm paralyzed in what I'm doing, and I don't want to face re-entry back into the business world with some of the staff that I have.
No, I think Ken, appreciate it. No, I think I understand what you're getting at. And earlier, before the call even started, I was interested to hear that I think Randy was talking to Michelle, about companies hiring under these circumstances. But I think what you're really looking at is the opposite side, is outplacing people during this time. Ken, again, and I know I drive everything back here, but it comes back to leadership. What it sounds like is that the leaders lack the moral courage to do the hard thing, which is bring that individual, whether they bring them back to the workplace, whether they go somewhere else, it's almost irrelevant. But to have that hard conversation, and what I would imagine is probably also happening underneath there is that there were some hard conversations that needed to occur before now that didn't occur. So it's almost like, now, but again, that the leadership drove the culture of, hey, let's just kind of push problems aside. Let's not confront them. And there's some, personal skills associated with this, emotional intelligence of hey, when I initially see an employee having an issue, having a problem, what am I doing about it? And it's not a, hey, I got you. It's, hey, how do I help you be successful? And if that's not part of your culture that's driven by the leadership to do everything they can to make people successful, but just sort of, hey, if you don't cut it, you're gone, you're out of here. Then that company that you're talking about, that you're mentioning they're right now, they're reaping what they've sown. Yeah, and then again, depending upon the type of organization and what their governance is, if that leader also happens to be the owner of the company, that's problematic. If certainly if it's a large corporation that has a board of directors, you know, there is nothing more important that a board of directors does than hire and fire the CEO. You know, typically, you know, people don't just move into these senior leadership positions and all of a sudden change their behavior and their attitudes.
Right.
I'd have discussions, not always well received, with senior Army leadership about senior leader misconduct. And, you know, there are stories upon stories, you know, I don't even have to give names, you remember them from the news, of these folks that were so far off the reservation, you know, that, you know, there wasn't just a mistake. It just wasn't something that happened recently. You know that years and years ago, there were leading indicators that there was either some sort of personality disorder or whatever that led someone down this path. And again, had to have been, particularly in the Army, it had to have been underwritten by their leaders. It had to have been, if not endorsed, it had to be at least permitted or allowed. And it was because, and then oftentimes it's because people didn't want to have the hard conversation. People didn't want to have that hard discussion. You know, I know of an Army general who left the Army under bad circumstances of his own doing. And just like almost every other leader I know, when something very serious comes out, when you talk to other people about it, the conversation, it never fails. It always starts the same way. That doesn't surprise me, because when so-and-so and I were at blank, he or she did X. Well, then in this one instance, I asked this person who was actually a superior of mine, so when he did that, what did you do? Oh, well, nothing, because we were peers, we were office mates, this, that. I said, well, you're part of the problem, sir. You know, you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. And again, it goes to, you know, what are your values? And you got to have that moral courage to do that.
I think that ties in well to our next question from Nick. How do you achieve a balance in your culture between healthy friction or a culture where people become combative or contrarian?
Yeah. In general, and you know, whether you read Peter Lencioni or some of the other management and leadership people that study management and leadership, most of the time in organizations, you really have to drive that healthy friction. I think most people, not everyone, most people want to get along with the people they work with. They want to reduce the transaction costs of coordinating and working with other parts of their organization, and they're actually less likely to drive that conflict into to disagree, certain, especially in public, you know, whether it be a board meeting or a staff call or something like that. In fact, normally the leader needs to drive that healthy friction, whether it's by doing some, you know, in the military, I've seen it in industry called as well, but red teaming, where you have someone who's looking at each of the arguments that are made and identifying any gaps in those arguments, those positions, you know, or even assigning someone within your organization to be that devil's advocate, to say, well, I hear you, but what about this, this, and this? You know, how do you in a disciplined manner go about testing assumptions and testing assumptions? Do you have, if, again, particularly if it's a major decision, if everybody around the table is agreeing, then that's a problem. That should be a red flag that says, hey, we need to investigate this some more. There may be some things that we're not looking at. If your head of HR, your head of operations, your head of logistics, if they all say, oh yeah, this is great, we all agree, particularly after not going through an extensive discussion and debate period, then you're not looking hard enough at the problem. So again, it's incumbent on that leader to really to drive that healthy friction.
Well, that's a pretty common leadership weakness, to surround yourself with a team that tells you you're right all the time. I've never had that problem. Most people felt pretty comfortable telling me I didn't know what I was talking about, but that is a common leadership weakness. Did you ever have to address that in the Army?
No, absolutely. Again, being a hierarchical organization, even though at the higher levels it's pretty collegial, that's always a challenge. People will read you, try to figure out, okay, so what is it that he or she, the leader, he or she wants to hear? Where are they leaning? So again, as a leader, what you've got to do is you've got to be very careful about how you describe problems, how you give guidance, that you're not sort of tipping your hand, what your biases are, because everyone has biases, and that's another self-awareness problem that a lot of people have, is that they don't actively try to identify their biases. I always, when I bring new folks into the organization, or I'm new to the organization, I always sit down with them one-on-one, particularly if they're in a leadership position, say, in what ways are you biased? I don't ask them if they're biased, because everyone's biased. Okay, there's bias about different things. I see Mike Kenny on, and I think Drew's on, and I'll tell you what, some of it depends on the culture, and in the Army, oftentimes it's about appearance. What's the individual's haircut look like? Do they look like they're fit? That is a bias that is reinforced by the culture. So again, you've got to be able to take a look at that and see how you're helping drive that healthy friction. But that is a big problem in the Army, and sometimes it's the way people react. That's the other thing with the leader. How does the leader react to it? I'll give you an example. When I got selected for promotion to Brigadier General, they bring every single person of that year that got selected. They bring them all together in one place, and they have it's General Officer Basic Education or something like that. They used to call it charm schools. They actually used to literally teach you how to, what fork to use and stuff like that. It's not like that anymore. But during one of the presentations, one of the, in fact, he has already been promoted to Brigadier General. He asked a question I thought was a very good question. It was a challenging question. It was a tough question, and the individual that was, and he asked this of one of the Army's 4-stars, and the individual was certainly capable and started answering. And then the Chief of Staff of the Army comes, literally storming up in front of the room and just berates this 1-star, about the question that he asked. I think, it was a fine question, but and by the way, I didn't tell you, your wives are also there sitting next to you. So this guy not only dressed down this 1-star in front of all of his peers, he dressed him down in front of his wife. And I tell you, that individual was the chief of staff of the Army for several years. I had a couple more years. I had many interactions with him, and it was always the same. In fact, it got to the point where he would hold meetings and someone would give a presentation and everyone would nod their head because they knew that if he didn't ask a question or if he wasn't critical of it, there was no use in them being critical of it. And I tell you what, we made some really bad decisions in the Army during that time because people were terrified. This individual was not only the chief of staff of the Army, he was also a very imposing figure, literally physically. So, again, how do you react? If you're as a leader shooting people down that are bringing contrary ideas to what you think, then it's not going to be long before people stop doing that.
Got a question from Mike Kinney. What's been your greatest challenge and learning opportunity transitioning from the Army to the private sector?
By far, my greatest challenge is living at home with my wife. My wife and I only lived together for 2 of the last 7 years that I was on active duty. Because the last 4 years, one was deployment, and then the last 4 years she stayed here with, so my youngest could graduate high school. And that's really why I retired, because she was like, 16 moves, I think is about enough. I said, that's pretty fair. Yeah, it's been sort of that change of lifestyle, going from working 60, 70 hours a week, being away from family, to now we're, completely immersed and at least, before this shutdown, if you will, at least I was getting out almost every day to go out and meet folks and learn about the business community here in Kansas City. So that's from a personal perspective, that's been a huge challenge. The other thing that I've learned is that, Mike, almost as much as people have a lack of understanding for the Army who haven't been in the Army, people who don't make a concerted effort to learn about the business community and the ways of business, I think that's equally as challenging and as difficult. It's not that what people did in the military, in the Army, doesn't translate to the business community and the private sector. It's that we have a hard time describing how it does. And again, I've been very fortunate because I've had jobs where I've worked a lot with industry, with academia. When I was the director of Army Business Operations, I was responsible for the Army's business initiative program. So I went out to Silicon Valley, to Detroit, you name it, to all the major corporations, all the big business schools, to figure out, okay, so what's sort of state of the art, and then what's state of the art that we can scale to 1.1 million people. That's often the challenge. Some things are great ideas and they work on a certain, and you folks that own businesses or run businesses, I'm sure you've come across this. Some things, some processes, some policies that work at a smaller level are very manageable, but some things only scale to a certain point, and that was a big challenge that we had in the Army. But again, I think understanding the differences, but even more importantly, being to explain that. I hear people all the time say, "Oh, well, you don't have any P&L experience." I said, "Well, if P&L experience is being evaluated based on your outputs with respect to your inputs, if that's what P&L is, then I've been doing that since day one. I've got over 30 years of experience doing that, and let me describe to you how we did that."
Got a question from Joel Vaterna. What are the common misconceptions by the public about the Pentagon and what goes on in there?
You know, the misconceptions actually don't start at the public. They actually started within the Army. There's a lot of people, and I see Drew's kind of smiling there. You know, I was stationed twice out here at Fort Leavenworth. In fact, that's why we're in Kansas City, because first time we were stationed here, we just fell in love with Kansas City, and we decided back in 2007 that when it was time to hang it up, that this is where we wanted to settle down. So we bought a house in '09. My wife's been here with the kids since 2011. But I can't tell you, depending on how you count it, at any time at Fort Leavenworth, there's about 60 colonels stationed there. And I cannot tell you how many times, and Drew and I probably have talked about this over a beer sometime. I can't tell you how many times I've seen colonels, you know, wear as a badge of honor that they were never stationed at the Pentagon. Because they see, yeah, Drew's giving the thumbs up. And what I always say is, hey, if you want to learn about the Army as an organization, as an enterprise, and if you want to help secure the resources for soldiers and their families, what they need, there's no better place. Now, after I left there the first time, I swore I'd never go back, but I wound up going back, I think 2 more times. The stakes are very, very high, but you've got lots of folks. About half of the people at Headquarters Department of the Army and at the Pentagon are civilians. Almost all of those are career civilians. Some are very high-level political employees, but you know, they're all there trying to serve. And there are very few people, you do run into them, but there are very few people who are interested in themselves, who are interested in really anything but furthering the Department of Defense, Department of the Army, Department of Navy, wherever they work. So there really are a lot of selfless servants who you know, commute an hour or more every day each way, you know, fighting the traffic, fighting mass transit. And again, they're just an incredible group of professionals.
Robert asks about cybersecurity with so many people working from home, and you've talked about how in the Army that was already taking place. There's increases in ransomware and malware. You know, what are your recommendations for how businesses address that?
Yeah. Whether it's in the military, the rest of the government, or even in the private sector, the biggest cybersecurity risk is the employee, is the individual on their computer who isn't doing what they should be doing. Some organizations have very active programs where, you know, they will actually send out you know, phishing emails within their organization to see how many people are clicking on them. But you know, there was an advantage that we had in the Department of Defense, is that we had very good firewalls set up, but working remotely was always a challenge. And you know, just something as simple as someone not having their computer, you know, connected to the network for a given period of time, and they miss a patch, and you don't have the your network isn't set up so that before that individual can do anything, the next time they log on, that those patches are downloaded. We had a Army 4-star who was traveling, missed a patch, and shut down half of Headquarters Department of the Army's email for about 6 days while they scrubbed all the computers. But I tell you, one thing I have learned, and I've done quite a bit of work in this area of cybersecurity, is, man, you got to have a professional. You got to have people that really know what they're doing. I sometimes, and again, I've got some background in this area. What I think oftentimes, myself and Norton, we can handle everything. Well, shoot, 2 days ago, and I apologize to anyone on this call who got a rogue email from my LinkedIn account, but my LinkedIn account got hacked. So, the threat's real. Just Department of Defense networks. We don't measure in how many attacks per day on the network, or attacks per hour, or even attacks per minute. We talk about how many attacks are going on at any given time, and it's alarming, it's disturbing. But I've been working with a couple companies here in town, and there's some unbelievable statistics out here. That a company that has a cyber breach has an 80% chance of never regaining the profitability that it had prior to that cyber breach. Okay, and that's a statistic that comes from the FBI. Within 5 years. So the challenge and the threat out there is real. It's constant. It's not just a matter of who's trying to get your information, whether it's your individual information, your customer's information, but how hard are they willing to work for it? To what expense in time and money are they willing to do that? And then what's your plan? I can't tell you how many people I've talked to. They have no plan for, okay, what happens when we have a breach and our customer's information gets out? Well, who's going to talk to your customers? Who's going to talk to the public? Who's going to, literally, whose job is it to call the FBI? Okay, whose job is it to call local law enforcement? And to get out ahead. And oh, by the way, not just have a plan, but you got to rehearse the plan. And I tell you, it's less than 1 out of every 10 companies that I've talked to have a plan in place and have rehearsed the plan. And people in the organization are aware of the plan.
So you'd recommend business leaders be developing and practicing those plans right now?
No, yeah, absolutely. Because again, it's not a matter of if. For most of us, it's a matter of when. And then what do we tell people? I'll give you an example, just from my personal experience the last couple of days. I recognized that my LinkedIn account got hacked. Shortly after, I added a bunch of folks to my as a LinkedIn connection that I met here on your Q&A last week, Randy. And so I sent emails from my email account out to those people and said, hey, I'm really sorry. If you get an email from me, LinkedIn email, and it looks kind of funny, it's not for me. I got hacked. But yeah, absolutely. If you're a leader, if you're a business owner, have a defense plan and have a contingency plan on what happens if you are compromised. Because I tell you, the last thing one of your customers or suppliers wants to know is that their information got out there, and to hear they got it because of a breach in your system, and they're finding out about it from someone other than you.
Well, any last questions from the group?
Yeah, Randy, question for David. Moving to 30,000 feet, I understand the military takes their orders from the commander in chief. The last 2 presidents have taken completely opposite positions with the country of Iran, for instance. I'm wondering, from a Pentagon standpoint, what's the perception of the highest threat to the United States today?
Oh, the highest threat to the United States today is Russia, followed very closely by China. And this is all, this is in our national security policy. And then after that, North Korea and Iran. I mean, hands down, Russia has the capability and is positioned geographically and has shown the intent and willingness. Just look at Ukraine and Crimea to threaten their neighbors and our allies in Europe.
Well, there are a lot of positive comments that came through, David. Got a number of folks that sent through on the chat here. Like Adam said, there's some crazy smart people on this call right here. So it's awesome to just sit back and listen and hear from this crowd. We could go for hours and keep learning. But I appreciate everyone getting on. It was a great group, and I love the questions, and I love your answers, David. So thanks for doing this.
Hey, Randy, if the general has time, I have one last question.
Sure.
Regarding your experience in the military and vaccinations. I don't know if you can share with us or if it's classified, but were you vaccinated quite often to protect you from these types of viruses? And what was your opinion on those vaccinations?
Well, I'll give you an example. You're always required to have not only the basic immunizations, but anywhere you travel, there usually, there's specific, whether it's yellow fever or whatever, specific immunizations that you had to have. You had to have the flu shot every year. And all these are, of course, unless there's some other underlying medical issue that you can't have that. It's well known we received starting, I think, 99, 98, started receiving anthrax vaccinations. Not everyone in this group, I'm sure, has. I know some. I'm sure some have, but for instance, a lot of people in this group, I'm sure, haven't been vaccinated for smallpox. But anyone that deployed to Iraq or Afghanistan and some other countries, had to get those immunizations. I tell you, I guess I probably should have an opinion on those things, but I tell you, I just I'm not sure if I have. I guess I should have been more concerned. I guess I don't know. But yeah, from my perspective, it was a requirement. It was just one of those things. When you join the military, there's certain curtailments of what are generally accepted as civil rights for other folks. Whether it be not being able to make political statements, associating us, if you can't attend a political rally in a uniform or anything like that. And that's one thing I would like to add is, I tell you, I get this question a lot about political positions and things like that. And I'll tell you, in all honesty, in 31 plus years in the Army, I never participated in, and I'm not sure I ever heard a political discussion. Whether whether it's, hey, I support this person, I don't support this person, etc. And it's not even an exception. It's just a fact is, after an election or even leading up to an election, we would start planning and preparing for potential changes in posture based on the political platforms of the candidates, major candidates. which is just, it's not political. It's just prudent because you don't know who's going to win. So you got to start planning. So again, from my perspective, I think everyone should feel pretty good, should feel very good rather about sort of the state of, and I'll just speak for the Army, but it goes across the Department of Defense, as far as the state of your Army being politically agnostic. So just what I know that was the last question. Just one last thing, two things actually. One is, if anyone has any experience, I mentioned this earlier, with working with LinkedIn for a hacked account, please let me know. I've already filled out their trouble ticket. Have not heard anything back. I even called the phone number that I found online, and they said, "Hey, yeah, we don't accept voicemails. We're too busy." But if you got any advice, let me know. And then the second thing and final thing, Randy, is for the group here is, please let me know how I can help you. I've got a lot of experience in a wide variety of capacities, whether it's long-term, whether it's strategy development, strategy implementation, measuring progress along the, to achieve that strategy, operations, long-range financial, fiscal planning. Please just, these are trying times for everyone. We're all on the same team. I spent, thanks to all you and the rest of the taxpayers, I spent 31 great years in the Army, had a lot of tremendous experience, and very proud of having served in the best Army in the entire world. And what I want to do now is help get our economy back to being the best economy in the entire world. And our economy, make no mistake about it, even after my experience in the military, our economy is the greatest strength of our nation. So if there's anything I can do to help anyone, even, just need like a fresh set of eyes just to run an idea by, please let me know, because I truly am here to help and love to continue to serve our country.
David, thank you very much. Randy, this was terrific. Thank you as well.
General, you did this is extremely informative. Very, very, very well done. Really appreciate it.
Glad to help, Carl.
Have a great weekend. Good to see all of you.
Thanks,
Thank you very
Randy.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Randy.
Bye.
Appreciate it. Thanks, Randy.
Thank you, Randy.